We're starting a new series today about heroes. By the way, the fact that the colors on the graphics are Buffalo Bills colors, that's purely coincidental. So in this series, we're going to look at Nehemiah's story. It's a fascinating story. I'm excited to tell it because it's just so interesting. But I'm also excited to tell it because it's more than history. There are principles for modern day lay heroes. I said we're going to look at Nehemiah's story. Nehemiah was a civil servant in the Persian Empire during the 5th century BC. Nehemiah led a national revival and a major construction project. And that's really surprising because he lived hundreds of miles away from the need. You can look here on this map I have for you. You can see where Jerusalem is. There's a little star there. And then you go all the way to the other side and you see that's where Susa is. That's the city where Nehemiah is living. And so that's hundreds of miles away. And you can't just go straight across there because in the middle is a huge desert. And so the only way really to get across there is to go up and around the top. And so in Nehemiah, here he is. He's living in Susa. He doesn't have vacation time. And even if he did, it wouldn't be sufficient because, you got to go by foot or by camel or something like that. And you got to go all this way around. So surprising that Nehemiah is able to do what he does given his circumstances where he's at. So lots in this book I'm looking forward to looking at with you. Lay hero. What is a lay hero? Well, simply a lay hero is a lay person used by God to make a significant difference. It's a lay person used by God to make a significant difference. As a result of God working through the life and energy of this lay person, someone else gets rescued, or someone is delivered, or a problem is solved, a change is made, someone's life is impacted in a way that lasts forever, something like that. A lay person used by God makes a major difference. That person is a lay hero. Now, before we go any further, let me just pause for a moment. This series, I'm going to be talking mostly to Jesus followers. And if you're watching today and you wouldn't consider yourself a Jesus follower, number one, hey, please hear me. I'm so glad you're here. I hope you'll stay tuned in and watch every part. There will be principles, especially in parts 3 and 4, that apply to everyone, Jesus follower or not. But most of this is going to apply to Jesus followers because we're talking about lay people that God uses to make a difference. But that doesn't mean that God doesn't use people who aren't Jesus followers. So I'm really glad you're here. I'm glad you tuned in, and I hope you'll stick with it. And I hope as well, and just, spoiler alert, I'm praying that God will use this series in your life as well. So a little background so that we can make more sense of the story as we jump into it. God had made a covenant between himself and the nation of Israel. There were a few things that they had to do, and we've talked about this in previous series, but in short, there were 3 really big requirements they had. One was they were to have God was going to be their only God. They couldn't have a variety of gods. Number 2, they had to keep a few laws about things that were clean and unclean, and these laws were reminders of that relationship they had with God. And then number 3, they were supposed to be amazingly humanitarian in their dealings with other people. Well, Israel broke that covenant over and over again. And not only did they break it, they refused to repent when they were confronted by the prophets that God sent to them. And so, just as God had promised and told them would happen, the nation of Israel was attacked and it was overtaken, including the capital city of Jerusalem. During the attack, the walls that surround the city that protected the inhabitants were pulled down, the gates were burned, and the survivors of that battle were exiled. After 70 years, exiles were permitted to return, and some of them did. And they got back and they went to that area of Israel and to the city of Jerusalem, and the temple was reconstructed, but they didn't reconstruct the city walls. They had attempted once for a little bit, and there was some severe opposition, and so they gave up on that. When we get to Nehemiah and the story we're going to look at in just a moment, it's now been 140 years since that battle and since the exile began, since the walls were torn down. It's been a few years since the attempt to rebuild the walls. Nehemiah lives in Babylon, which was the land of exile, and his job is he is the cupbearer to the king. And so someone who's close to the king, but he also had that challenging job of sipping the wine before the king did to make sure it wasn't poisoned. And that was a really big deal because the previous several kings had been assassinated. And so that's Nehemiah's job. He's a Jew living in Babylon, serving the king. Let's jump into the story. Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 1. The words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah. During the month of Chislev in the 20th year, when I was in the fortress of Susa, Hanani, one of my brothers, arrived with men from Judah, and I questioned them about Jerusalem and the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile. And they said to me, the remnant in the province who survived the exile are in great trouble and disgrace. Jerusalem's walls have been broken down, and its gates have been burned. Verse 4, when I heard these words, I sat down and I wept. And I mourned for a number of days, fasting and praying before the God of heavens. And I said, Lord, the God of the heavens, the great and awe-inspiring God who keeps his gracious covenant with those who love him and keeps his commands. And the prayer continues. We'll look more at the prayer later. Nehemiah got this visit. Heard, I don't think the news that the walls had been torn down, that wasn't new to him. I think what is so distressful is hearing about the attempt to rebuild the walls and how that was ended quickly. And there's so much suspicion about Jerusalem, and so the people are in disgrace and they're living out, unsafe, with no one really to come to the rescue, no one really to protect them, no one to stand up for them, and no hope on the horizon. Let's talk about what makes a lay hero. We're going to grab a few things from Nehemiah's situation and his story, his qualities. Number one, a lay hero is not a pro-religious worker, right? They're not a professional religious worker. We're going to look at another guy, Ezra, here in just a second. Ezra was a professional religious worker. He was a scribe. And so he copied down the Old Testament scriptures to that point that they had. He was a professional. He was paid for religious work. Nehemiah was not. He was a cupbearer to the king. Number two, or second quality or makings of a lay hero is this. You don't have to be a perfect person. You're right. To be a lay hero, you don't have to be a perfect person. Ezra and Nehemiah were contemporaries of each other and both experienced exactly the same thing. They both encountered a time when people who had returned from the exile were doing the very same things that got them into trouble and got them exiled the first time. They were marrying their kids off to people from other cultures who followed other gods, and that's exactly how it had happened throughout Israel's history over and over and over again. Your kids marry somebody, or you marry somebody who worships another god, and before you know it, you're worshiping another god, and then when God calls you and says, hey, what are you doing? You're not paying attention to God anymore, so you're breaking the covenant over and again. Both of these guys, Ezra and Nehemiah, encountered this among the exiles who should have known better. Right? Watch what happens. This is Ezra chapter 9, verse 1. After these things had been done, the leaders approached me and said, the people of Israel, the priests, and the Levites were other paid religious workers in those days. The Levites have not separated themselves from the surrounding peoples whose detestable practices are like those of the Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Jebusites, Ammonites, Moabites, Egyptians, and the Amorites. Indeed, the Israelite men have taken some of their daughters as wives for themselves and their sons, so that the holy seed has become mixed with the surrounding peoples. The leaders and the officials have taken the lead in this unfaithfulness. When I heard this report, I tore my tunic and robe. I pulled out some of the hair from my head and my beard, and I sat down devastated. Everyone who trembled at the words of God, of the God of Israel, gathered around me because of the unfaithfulness of the exiles, while I sat devastated until the evening offering. At the evening offering, I got up from my time of humiliation with my tunic and my robe torn. Then I fell on my knees and spread out my hands before the Lord my God. And I said, my God, I am ashamed and embarrassed to lift my face toward you, my God, because our iniquities are higher than our heads and our guilt is as high as the heavens. Ezra's reaction. When he got this news, when he found out what was happening, that they were repeating the same infractions that their forefathers had, that they were putting their desire for these women ahead of their desire to keep the covenant and to be in a right relationship with God. When Ezra found out about that, he tore his clothes and then he pulled out some of his hair from his head and his beard, and he just sat there devastated for the rest of the day. That was Ezra's reaction. By the way, doesn't that sound like a really godly reaction? Like, wow, that's what I think Jesus would do, right? That was Ezra's reaction. Let's see how Nehemiah responded to the same situation. This is Nehemiah chapter 13, verses 25 to 28. I rebuked them, these guys who had married the others. I rebuked them, cursed them, beat some of their men, and pulled out their hair. I forced them to take an oath before God and said, you must not give your daughters in marriage to their sons or take their daughters as wives for your sons or yourselves. Didn't King Solomon of Israel sin in matters just like this? There was not a king like him among many nations. He was loved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Yet foreign women drew him into sin. Why then should we hear about you doing all this terrible evil and acting unfaithfully against our God by marrying foreign women? Even one of the sons of Jehoiada, son of the high priest Eliashib, had become a son-in-law to Sanballat the Horonite. So I drove him away from me. Catch Nehemiah's reaction? Both these guys, Ezra and Nehemiah, they pulled out hair. Ezra pulled out some of his own hair. Nehemiah pulled out their hair, right? It's like, yeah, I'm not pulling out my hair. You're the guys who are bad. I'll pull some of your hair. He said, I rebuked them. I cursed them. I beat some of them. I pulled out their hair. And I forced them to take an oath. And I drove this guy away from me. Like, you've got no part with me. If you're not going to change, you are out of here. I was thinking about, as I was reading this passage, about making a joke about, one of the guys in our church who's bald was like, hey, did Nehemiah get a hold of you? Right? I don't know. Was Nehemiah right in what he did? I don't know. Maybe it's like, Jesus when he was cleaning out the temple, from the guys who were selling and ripping people off. Maybe not. But this I know, you don't have to be a perfect person to be a lay hero, to be somebody that God uses to make a significant difference. The third thing in this idea of makings of a lay hero, what a lay hero is not, is a lay hero is not a lone ranger. This book that we're going to be looking at together, Nehemiah, was originally called Ezra Nehemiah, because it's one story and the two work together. In fact, in the Hebrew Bible, I'm told, it is still one book called Ezra Nehemiah, because the stories go together and they were both living during the same time, trying to do some of the same stuff, two halves to one story. Nehemiah and Ezra found a way to work together, even though they had very different temperaments. I was reading a commentary by a guy named Yamauchi, I think is how you pronounce that, and he pointed that out. It was so awesome. God used these two because they weren't lone rangers. They recognized that God had brought them to address the same need, different angles, very different temperaments, but they found a way to work together. Very rarely is a lay hero a lone ranger, somebody who's got everything they need to accomplish all that needs to be accomplished. So that's what a lay hero is not, right? They're not a professional religious worker. They're not a perfect person. They're not a lone ranger. So what are they? Well, two things. Number one, a lay hero is full of faith. A lay hero is full of faith. And by that, I don't mean like they believe everything. They've got a faith that never doubts. I'm not talking about that. What I mean is they are confident of God's character and God's promises. Back to verse 5. I said, Lord, the God of the heavens, the great and awe-inspiring God who keeps his gracious covenant with those who love him and keeps his commands. Nehemiah is full of faith. He believes that God exists. He believes that God is great and God is awe-inspiring. And he believes that God keeps his promises. God keeps his covenant with those who do what they have been asked to do. So a lay hero is full of faith. They're confident. They're confident that God is who he says he is. They're confident that God will do what God says he will do. Second thing that a lay hero is a lay hero is not okay. A lay hero is not okay. By that I mean they're not they're not okay with something that's going on. There is something that really deeply bothers them. Notice Nehemiah's reaction. He said, verse 4, when I heard these words, I sat down and wept. When he heard about how things were going in Jerusalem, he sat down and he just wept. And he mourned for a number of days and he fasted, right? He went without food as a way of focusing himself before God and humbling himself before God. And he went these days of praying before the God of heavens and saying, God, this is not okay. What strikes me about Nehemiah, and I think one of the keys to why he gets used by God is this: he was sensitive to this thing, this situation, when others were apathetic or cynical. The walls, guys, had been down for 140 years. Was it a big deal that they were down? And if so, why wasn't every Jew trying to find a way to rebuild the walls? Well, because, they had tried a few years ago and got in trouble. Because it wasn't, I can't, what am I going to do? The walls are huge. Well, they had found another way around it. Nehemiah was used by God because he saw as unacceptable what others had learned to live with. He was not okay. This was not okay. And because this was not okay, he wasn't okay with it. He found it unacceptable, this situation that they were in, even though others had learned to live with it. And that leads us to the first lay hero principle. We're going to see at least one in each of our times together. A lay hero is full of faith and is not okay. A lay hero is not okay, but they're full of faith, right? This story that we're going to look at, you already know a little bit of how it ends. I already told you, Nehemiah is used by God to rebuild the wall and lead a national revival. This story addresses some of the challenges that you and I face, like not feeling qualified enough or resourced enough to change the thing that's not okay. Some of us, we're not apathetic. We're not cynical. We see the problem. We see something that's going on and we're like, this is not okay. This is not acceptable. But we don't feel like, man, I can't do anything about it. Right? I'm not resourced enough. I'm not qualified enough. I don't have whatever it would take. This story is going to address that challenge. And one of the things that stands out to me as I think about that already is this: that tears are often more powerful than training, than talent, than treasure, right? More powerful than our training, more powerful than money and other resources, more powerful than insight and wisdom and talent, wall building. It was Nehemiah's tears. If he had, let's face it, if he had all that, if he had money, if he knew how to build walls, but he was okay with the fact that they were down, he would have never been used by God to spark that revival and build those walls. Brokenness is often a superpower for lay heroes. Brokenness is often a superpower. We've been reading a book as pastors and deacons together about what are the qualities of somebody that God uses. And one of them is, one of the four that this author keeps pointing out, is brokenness. Somebody who is desperate before God, desperate and broken before God over a situation and desperate for God to do something about it. Brokenness is often a superpower. This story we're going to look at is going to just bear that out for us. Another challenge that this story addresses that we all face is apathy or cynicism. That tendency to just believe that things either can't change or to not even be deeply bothered by what's not right in the world or in our family or where we work or with, you name it. This story is going to point out to us that because of a person's sensitivity to God, a lay hero will make a significant difference. But it starts with that sensitivity to God and the things that break God's heart. But not only is that person going to make a significant difference, they're going to experience God in a deeper way than semi-apathetic Christians do. A lay hero doesn't just make a difference. I gave you kind of that definition at the front end. But a lay hero also experiences God in a deeper way than their semi-apathetic Christian brothers or sisters. And I need to remind you again, if you are a Jesus follower, your new heart longs for both of these things. Your new heart that God gave you longs to be part of something that's bigger than you. Your new heart longs to do what it is that God put you on this world for. Your new heart defines success as living for the purpose for which I was created. And your new heart will never be content with a less than optimal experience of God and closeness with God. When God invites somebody to become a lay hero, He's inviting them to experience Him as well as to make a difference. There's a passage that talks about Jesus on the last night where before He was betrayed and crucified. It's recorded for us in Matthew 26. And in this passage, it talks about Jesus inviting three guys in. Let me just read it to you. This is Matthew 26, verse 36. Then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane, and He told the disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." And then taking along Peter and two of the sons of Zebedee, He began to be sorrowful and troubled. And He said to them, "I am deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and stay awake with me." And going just a little farther, He fell face down and prayed, "My Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will." Peter, James, and John were invited into proximity with Jesus where they could see His distress. They could see His tears. They could hear just over there was their friend, Master, Rabbi, Lord, Jesus, crying out to God. They were invited into that to be able to see that. Friends, I believe that God has invited some of you into the garden, metaphorically speaking, that God has invited some of you into the garden to see His tears. He has invited you into the circle of those who see His distress. And I believe that He's already done that for some of you, and I believe for others, God is going to invite you to be close enough to Him that you're going to be able to see something in our world that breaks His heart. And as a result of seeing this thing that breaks the heart of Jesus, this thing that is not okay, you won't be okay. This series is for you. The already invited, the ones who are already bothered deeply about something that breaks the heart of Jesus, and it's also for the soon to be invited, those who God is going to stir your heart. And He's going to invite you to live close enough to Him that the things that make His heart beat a little faster, make your heart beat a little faster. And the things that break His heart, break your heart. And probably one or two things in particular, especially, are going to catch your attention. And you are going to say, this is not okay. This is not acceptable. And even though the people around you might be apathetic or cynical or don't really see the problem or don't think anything can be done about the problem, you are going to be turned to God and go, God, we got to do something. Something's got to change here. Let's wrap this up. As you're hearing all this, you may not see yourself as a lay hero. I get that. You may be going, whoa, Pastor Andy, you are intense today. You may not see yourself as a lay hero. You may see yourself as a lay person, but just a normal, average, everyday lay person, a lay Jesus follower. You may not see yourself as a lay hero. But what if God does? Man, that's the question I'm really hoping you'll ponder this week. You may not see yourself as a lay hero, but what if God does? What if God wants to overcome your lack of qualifications or your lack of resources and your hesitancy to live with a heart that isn't okay, a heart that breaks over something that breaks Jesus' heart? What if God wants to do all this in a way that you see and experience a side of Jesus that many people miss? You could be a lay hero. And that may be exactly how God sees you. We'll talk more in part 2.